since you're teachers, and I know that you all love touchy-feely things because that's because your students do, and you're doing that great important work to try to keep your students engaged. So I'm going to treat you like you treat your students, which I'm sure is great, and I'm going to pass these around so that you can actually hold some of these things in your hand, and we'll be learning about what these are and their significance within a cultural context. Right now you're just seeing objects. Some of you may know something about them. Others will probably be learning a lot of new things today. This is a Pai Indian pot. It's made pretty much in the same way that this type of pottery has been made for probably about 1,000 years. We'll see how it's made in the slides today. Has this beautiful fire clouding that makes it, gives it a wonderful sort of a natural design. And this was a type of a pot that you might find out in the desert in a cave or even in an archaeological site, pretty much with this same type of a shape to it. It's a very typical shape, except for one thing, that nowadays they're made for coffee tables. So you see this one can be set here and it doesn't roll over. The older pots are usually round on the bottom, and we'll find out why that is when we get to the to that part of the slides. But that's something that has to do with the changing function of these, from being utilitarian objects to becoming art objects. That's part of the changes in culture. Here, my lovely assistant Vicky is going to be helping out here. I also will be passing around some examples of junkus basketry. We won't have as much information today on the junkus, but this is very important, one of the most important arts of Native people of our area, and actually was made originally throughout Southern California, this type of split junkus coil basketry. And today there's one village in particular, San Jose de la Zorra, which we'll mention, and they have quite a few artisans that are still making this wonderful type of basketry. This smaller basket in particular is very well made. If you hold it up to the light, you really only see the little hole in the bottom here, but you don't see holes in between. It's made by a younger artisan, and that beautiful larger one is made by an older woman whose eyesight isn't as good, but she does fabulous work. So you can see some different examples of junkus basketry. This is a pine needle basket made by the Pai, but these were also made by the Mountain Cahuilla and other groups up here. So you can at least get an example of what these were like. This one has a little lid. As Ken Hedges at Museum of Man will always point out, lids were not really something people used in the past, but again, it has to do with the changing functions. People want to buy their little basket with a little lid on it. This is a willow basket. Chiquin, it's called in Kumeyaay, and this was originally made as a huge maybe acorn storage granary. This type of basketry was made all throughout the Southwest. Anywhere where people needed to store a certain type of a grain or seed, whether they were agricultural peoples or hunters and gatherers, they all needed to store things. So originally they made great huge granaries. Today, again, changing functions, they're making smaller ones for sale to tourists. So you can have your own mini granary. Now be sure to smell that when you pass it around too. It has a wonderful willow smell. And then just so you can see something made by the Kiliwa. So Leonore also is an artisan. She makes wonderful traditional clothing, beads out of different types of wild seeds and wood and things. And then she makes these alforjas, which are really more from the mission period and the ranch period. These were pack bags. You make larger ones and put them on either side of the back of a mule or a burro, and that way you could carry things around. My great-grandfather was his life project was moving trout up in the San Pedro Martir, the same place where they're doing the Condor release. And he writes about packing everything up every summer to be able to spend the summer up in the San Pedro Martir. this trout thing was just an excuse to spend every summer up in the mountains. But he says that he would fill one of those up. He'd put flour in the bottom and then put some eggs in there, uncooked eggs, put some more flour, more eggs, more flour, and never did he have one egg break. So, and I'm also going to pass this around. If you're really interested in knowing more about rock art of Baja California, which I won't go into that much in this talk, but this is a wonderful book by Harry Crosby, one of our local luminaries. Fantastic job that Harry's done on researching the rock art. There's some great photography in here, and Harry's also done a lot of great work on the California culture, the people that still live up in the mountains of Baja California that are the descendants of native people and Spaniards, and keep that kind of a culture that's sort of the hybrid of those two cultures alive. And finally, as long as I'm on this beginning part where I'm passing everything around, this is the organization, one of the organizations that I work with, Native Cultures Institute. I don't know that I really have enough to go around of these, so take one if you're really interested, otherwise just pass it along. Thanks. Okay, I want to give you generally an idea about Native people of northern Baja California, but of course the border between Native groups of Baja California and Southern California, the border that we know today is an artificial border. It really has nothing to do with the people who've been in this land for thousands of years. That border was established, okay teachers, when did we establish that border? Anybody remember? California history. Good, 1850s, good, 1848, Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, okay? That's good. So it's really amazing if you think about it. It's only about 150 years ago that happened. That was at the time when there was a big land grab. We took California, Arizona, New Mexico, a lot of land that had previously belonged to Spain. But of course, long before that, it was all native land. And so that's when Baja California became a part of Mexico. Well, by that time it was Mexico. It wasn't Spain anymore, of course. And Alta California became what it is today. And so that meant that, unfortunately, native people who lived along that border region found that their lands, their ancestral lands, had been cut in half, and that it became more and more difficult over time for them to have contact with the people, with their own relatives, their cousins that lived on the other side of the border. So that's why I always start out with this slide that gives us an idea of what we call the Yuman family of languages and cultures. The Yuman, it's important to bear in mind that the Yuman grouping really spans, as we can see here, it spans the border, and it's been there for at least 1,000 years, if not many thousands of years. We're still not sure if it goes all the way back 10,000 years. According to native accounts, they've been here since the beginning of time. So that would suggest that they have been here as long as people have existed in these lands. Archaeologists also talk about different periods where we see different types of cultures that lived in the area, mainly 3 different cultures, big game hunters or Paleo Indians around 10,000 years ago, and then after the changes at the end of the Pleistocene, when everything started becoming more arid, a new type of culture where people are no longer depending so much on large game, but are really focusing more on grinding plants. We see a lot of milling stones. So that kind of a change happens. We don't know if it's just a response to the environmental changes or if actually new people came into the area. And then about 1,000 years ago in our area, and when I say our region, I really mean Southern California, northern Baja California, there's some very exciting changes that start happening. We start finding small arrowheads in a lot of archaeological sites. What would it mean that you're going from larger points to smaller arrowheads? Smaller animals. What kind of a tool would you be using? Why would you want a smaller point? Arrow, okay? It's no longer a spear or a dart like an atlatl with a spear thrower. The technology gets to where you can be farther away from that animal, and you can still kill a deer, but with a smaller point. So we start seeing that showing up in the archaeological sites, these smaller points. Another thing that we start seeing is potsherds. And so we see that a ceramic tradition has spread from over in the Colorado River area to our area. And it really only comes into into San Diego County and northern Baja. It's one of the ways that we know that these groups belong to this Yuman region. It also spreads up into the Cahuilla area, up as far as, say, Palm Springs and that area. But it's really not something we find through much of California. So by the time the Spanish come here and we have some of the first accounts of native people, we believe that those people that they met are the descendants of the people who are here today. Now, I assume that those of you who are teaching 4th grade can tell us whose lands are we in here? What native group originally inhabited these lands? Good, all right. You would be surprised how many talks I give and there's just all these blank faces. And then I say, well, do you know, for example, the names of some of the casinos? Oh yeah, Barona, Sequan, Viejas, yeah. Okay, well that's the name of the community, but the people are Kumeyaay, sometimes known as Tipai in the southern part of that territory, or Ipai further south. It's very confusing for you teachers because we like to have one name per group, but unfortunately they're also sometimes referred to as Diegueño, which comes from the Mission San Diego. The people related to the Mission San Diego were called Diegueño, sometimes called Mission Indians. And that's one of the worst terms we have because Mission Indians refers to people from completely different linguistic groups, Cahuilla and other Luiseño, Cupeño, or some other Southern California groups that are often called Mission Indians, when actually those are cultures and languages that in many ways are very different. So in the last few years, people have started using Kumeyaay quite a bit more. But there's even a discussion within Native communities. Some people prefer Diegueño because that's what they grew up with. Now, of course, Baja California was originally inhabited by many different groups. The whole peninsula was, of course, a wonderful place for native people to live, except that there wasn't a lot of water. So we don't find that people were doing agriculture. There really isn't enough water to sustain agriculture. In fact, the mission project in Baja California was a failure for many reasons, but one of those reasons was the lack of water for Mediterranean-style agriculture, which is what the missionaries hoped to instill. But it didn't work out, and unfortunately that drastically affected the native populations, so that at the time of the arrival of missionaries, there was probably about 50,000 people in the peninsula, and today there are only about 1,200 or 1,500 native people left. So, so unfortunately, as in many places, that tragic history affected native people in a terrible way, and it's part of, I think, our responsibility as teachers to try to really present the whole history, not just the sugar-coated version, but really the whole history of what happened as a result of contact, and also something that native folks keep pointing out to us, that they are still here, and that their cultures are here, and that they're maybe not what we expect to see. We might want to see teepees and headdresses, but they are still here, and we should make an effort to know about their cultures and try to be respectful of that. One of the resources that I found very useful is kumeyaay.com. That's a website that was put together by Larry Benegas from Barona, And so it's a native perspective on history, on who we are, how we got here. There's also, you can subscribe to Kumeyaay Daily News and get a lot of information from Indian country, as I say, and find out what's happening locally. And there's also a lot of articles that are cut and pasted from different newspapers so that you can find out what's going on in the Indian world. Today, the groups of Baja California live in just 8 communities. These are the groups that have rights to their land. There are some other traditional settlements that never were able to get the title to their land. We have 4 Kumeyaay groups, which would be Juntas de Neji, San Jose La Zorra, the basketry community, San Antonio Necwa, and La Huerta. These groups are Kumeyaay, so you can see really their territory goes all the way up toward Escondido and originally came down, way down here, so all of this area would be Kumeyaay territory. There's also some traditional settlements around the Tecate area, and quite a few people have moved to the cities because they can't find work in their communities. We also have the Pai Pai. This is the group that I've worked with the most. Pai Pai in Santa Catarina, and then there's another Pai Pai settlement here. There's also the Kukapa, who are also on the U.S. side. In Somerton, Arizona, there's a Kokopah reservation. They're very closely related. They're cousins, brothers and sisters that are on either side of the border. And then the Kiliwa are the farthest south of all these groups. It's also useful to go on to kumeyaay.com and see where the Indian reservations are here in San Diego County. But do try to bear in mind that they don't just end at the border, that it's really one region. Now, one thing that's very important to bear in mind with our groups here is that people didn't just live in one place. You know, for most of our history as a species, we weren't sedentary. We were adapting our lives to nature, to the cycles of nature, rather than going in trying to change it all and put a concrete slab down and just live in one place and grow, do monocropping. And in most of our history, about 99% of our history as a species, we've been foraging people, hunting, gathering, fishing. People didn't need to do agriculture. And it pretty much goes for most of California, although there's some debate about how we define agriculture, and maybe people were manipulating plant populations. But for the most part, they weren't doing agriculture anything like what we consider agriculture. They didn't need to because the land gave them everything they needed. There was a certain carrying capacity that the land had, and the populations probably responded to that. And they learned over time how to interact with that environment in a way that was beneficial to them. So what does that mean? That means that if you are collecting a resource year after year, if you're going to gather acorns, or if you're going to gather manzanita berries or cactus fruits, you'll probably do it in a way that encourages that plant population also to survive or even to thrive. Or you might, as in the case of many of the basket makers, cut your materials or harvest your materials in a way that encourages the plants to grow back and give you nice long strands that you need for your harvesting. So we'll be talking more about that. Of course, native people did a lot of hunting, bighorn sheep, deer, which are important larger animal resources in this area. There were originally, anybody know what some of the other large animals that used to exist around here are? Cougar, what? Sloth. Sloth, maybe way back. Yeah, further earlier on. Cougar, yeah, and actually some folks would eat cougar. What else? Bear. Okay, bears. How about another horned animal? Pronghorn antelope. Which was another thing that people could hunt. So yeah, there were a lot of larger animals, but where do you think most of people's protein came from? Ocean, okay, marine resources, good. And smaller animals. So rabbits, hares, quail, and marine resources really made up the bulk of the diet as far as protein. Archaeologists have ways of studying the bone and figuring out, especially if there were a lot of marine resources that people were eating, it ends up, there's evidence that's left in the bone. So we find that, of course, with all these groups along the coast, that there were just fabulous coastal resources, and especially anywhere where there was an estuary coming out to the coast, like Mission Valley, you would have had all kinds of resources. Now, of course, Baja California is mostly coasts. It's a peninsula, so there's coasts on both sides. And as you all mentioned right away, those marine resources just provided a huge amount of food for people, great protein. And then, of course, shells could be used in many different ways. We find in shell middens all kinds of tools that people were making from shell. What else besides tools might they make from shell? Jewelry. Yeah, many different ways that people could use shells or also bones, marine mammal bones. I've seen a spatula for getting abalones off the rocks made from a seal bone. And we know that it was a spatula because it has the wear marks on it, and it also had a certain design that was carved onto it. So these areas are just very rich in resources. And what do we call the areas that we find where people had lived and deposited all their trash? Dumps. Middens. Shell middens. At least the middens along the coast are shell middens. These are basically shell. We find they're a treasure chest of information. Of course, they're not golden vessels or anything like that in there, but they're very important for understanding the history and prehistory of our land, of Southern California and Baja California. Unfortunately, development is really affecting a lot of these areas. Right now, there are several plans to put LNG gas terminals along the Baja California coast right on top of archaeological sites. So we're very concerned about losing a lot of important sites. Of course, people were pushed away from the coast early on. We don't find many native folks living along the coast after the mission era because the Spanish access to this area was mostly by boat. And so people had to hide in the mountains, find a good water hole where they could live, and try to continue their way of life, their hunting and gathering, but somewhere farther away from the coast, which of course was one of the things that really affected their population. They were no longer able to do an annual cycle like they had done in the past, and so they were weaker as a population. They were more affected by diseases that came by that spread even well in advance of the non-Indian population. Now, what we do know about this annual cycle that people carried out for a long, long time is that it appears that most groups would spend the winter time along the coast and then move up into the mountains as things warmed up. So of course, when it's really cold in the winter, you don't want to be up in the mountains. Then it's not a comfortable place to be. But of course, along the coast, it's usually raining, it's very green, there's all kinds of resources. But then people move up into the mountains as it warms up and find all kinds of other resources, including things like the yucca, there's juniper in the background. All of these things provide food and medicine, tools for native people. This is also the San Pedro Martir, one of the places where my grandfather planted trout. And you can see there are other resources here. The lupin that we have, this is a perennial lupin, has a kind of a seed that some groups would process, remove the poisons that it has, and then they could eat that, along with many other different types of foods. Along the eastern side of the peninsula, especially in the northeastern part, Mexicali south, we share part of the Sonoran Desert Province with Sonora, Arizona, Eastern California. So this is part of that ecosystem, and people also would have come down here for other resources. So you can see that people had access to all kinds of foods, medicines, different places. where they could live, where there was water. Of course, that was one of the most important things. And then also for different rituals and ceremonies. And we know that that was important because we find rock art all throughout the peninsula, which we don't really know what it means. A lot of it's geometric like this or abstract. Some of it's cave paintings that are more representational. But what we do know is that people took the trouble to do these things that aren't that easy. This is a petroglyph that's pectin rock, so it takes quite a bit of work. And the pictographs, the ones painted on rock, also many of those are way up on the tops of caves that you would have had to build big scaffolding to get up there and do that painting. So people surely had a type of a relationship with the land, with the animals, that goes way beyond something that we might that we can imagine. We think, well, let's go up to the mountains, you know, let's see, I can't do it for 3 more weekends, we'll go up for a day, you know, and then people just don't really have the time to really understand, to have that kind of a relationship with the land. Today there are quite a few places up here in the lagunas, in Cleveland National Forest, and in Sierra Juarez, the first mountain range that's really just an extension of those down into Baja California, and in Sierra Juarez, and well up into California, where we find stands of pinyon pines. There's 2 different kinds of pines here, but these are the pinions. They're this sort of pyramid-shaped pine. Some of these back here, some of are a different type of pine. But the pinyon has been very important also for a long time as a major source of food. So actually this time of year, August, September, people would have come from down by the Colorado River, come from all over Southern California, Northern Baja, and met at the big stands of pinyon pines. This was when they had some of the biggest gatherings, the ceremonies. Some of them were marking the passing of people who had died. Others were just social dances. And so this was a time of abundance when all these different bands who normally would be traveling, moving across the environment in smaller groups, would have gotten together and had a wonderful time and maybe met future mates. So today, many of these places are now protected, and unfortunately for native groups, often they can't get there and do the gathering of the pine nuts that they used to, or they'd have to get some kind of a permit, which, you know, they'd have to go from office to office and pay for the permit. So in many places, forest services are on both sides of the border are trying to work with that. They're realizing, hey, that's not fair, and these folks have been doing this for who knows how long, for many generations, and in fact it may be necessary for the forest, it may be part of what makes that forest what it is, to have this interaction with human populations. I had the opportunity when I did field work in 1980 to actually go up and accompany people on pine nut gathering. It was great. We camped up in the mountains for about 5 days, and the men would cover their whole bodies with, they had to wear long sleeve shirts because there's so much pitch that it's really hard to get off. So they had their certain outfit they would wear every year for gathering pine nuts, climb up, twist off the pine cones, throw them down, and then dry them out, and they open up. And it was a time of year that everybody enjoyed because you could sit around eating pine nuts, removing the pine nuts, and just enjoying them. Another important food is the tunas, as they're called, the prickly pear fruits. And these could be opened up and just eaten as is, of course, once you remove all the spines. And, or they could also be dried and stored and used at a later time. So that's really important part of the strategy of these folks. It's not, often hunters and gatherers are portrayed as just kind of going and picking fruits, you know, and oh good, there's prickly pear fruits this year. But actually, they had to know their plant resources very well. For example, pine nuts are alternate bearing. Some years there's a good pine nut harvest, other years there's not. How would you know that? Well, one of the elders from one of the communities told me, oh, we can tell when the greasewood is blooming that means it's time to go up to the pine nuts. That's when the harvest is. And I said, well, what if there's not going to be a pine nut harvest? And she said, well, the flowers will tell us. So I don't know how, if it's because there were fewer flowers or more, but they had, over thousands of years, developed all these ways of knowing their environment, knowing what to look for, so that they could survive. With prickly pears, you can also keep the seeds and grind those up and make a mush out of them. But again, that was a strategy for, say, a year when you didn't have a lot of food, because they said it's kind of bland. It wasn't one of their favorite foods. But if you needed it, it was there. Anybody know what this is? It's agave.
Oh, it's
agave. Maguey, they also call it agave. Yeah, and it's what tequila is made out of, a relative of this agave. This is a desert agave, it's called. And in fact, up in Palm Springs, many of the groups along the desert, the eastern escarpment of our Southern California mountains, still do the agave roast like this. I think out at the Morongo Museum every year they do an agave roast. And in Baja California, people are still doing this too. So what he's done, what Andres Albañez here has done, is to gather a lot of heads of agave. He's going to first, kind of looks like they're just all going to burn up, but he's burning off all those outer leaves and just leaving the heart. And then he's also put some rocks, some large rocks around in all this firewood, and those will heat up. And so at a certain point he covers everything with sand, and it's like he's made an oven. Those rocks are heating elements inside that sand oven, and he leaves it for a couple of days, and when he comes back, everything's cooked. And so one of the nice things here is that people actually get to taste it. We'll see that a little later on. Now, of course, people also had to know all about medicinal plants. They couldn't run down to the pharmacy and just get whatever medicine they needed. They needed to know how to do it all themselves. So here we have Teodora Cuero, who's a traditional authority from La Huerta, one of the Kumeyaay communities, and closely related to the Kumeyaay communities up here. And in this case, she was on a, this was, I think this was Arizona, with the Yavapai. The Yavapai Indians invited folks from Baja California up to reteach them about the knowledge of plants. And in Arizona, many of the folks there remembered the names of plants, but they didn't remember how they were used medicinally. So the folks in Baja California went up and retaught them a lot of their own culture. What kind of a home did they live in? Well, being hunters and gatherers and highly mobile people, they didn't build pueblos like more agricultural peoples of the Southwest did. They built structures that were appropriate for their way of life. So here we see a Kiliwa house that's just built from greasewood, or you might also call it chamise. It's very common out in the desert areas. Another thing that we can tell from this old photo is that there were probably potters living there, because as we'll see later on, to make the pottery you use those big stalks like they had there, the trunks, to burn the pottery. Now after the mission period, the shape of the houses changed. Why do you think it might have changed from that smaller round one to this larger size? It's the shape of a mission, okay? It's the shape of a different way of thinking, really. It's like this happens with indigenous people all over the world. Often traditional housing, traditional architecture is rounder, and when Western influences come in, everything sort of goes square. And also people were beginning to accumulate more things. They were sedentary. As of the mission period, people pretty much had to settle in one area. And so, well, once you're settled there, then you start accumulating more and more things. You know how it goes. And so they needed more space also. This is an example of a group of houses that existed when I did my field work. It's gone now because when people die, according to their tradition, they burn the house and the belongings of the person that died. And that's true here with the Kumeyaay, and most all of the Yuman groups have that belief. With the Pai Pai, the building of the house is work that's done by the women. The men may help with certain parts, but mostly the building, which is like the weaving of a large basket, You can see that here she's putting willow stalks in between those two branches. It ends up being quite a bit like one of those baskets that we passed around. So it's mostly work that the women do. Now, of course, when it comes time to take the picture, Josefina's brother came over. But I do have to give him a little credit. Actually, he helped do the thatching of the house. That seemed to be his special job here. And the thatching also is made from a certain type of, it's called sotole. It's also an agave relative. And it's amazing. You can be in these houses in a rainstorm, and they're perfectly waterproof. And they're very comfortable for the summertime. They're a little cold in winter. So we know that the missionaries in this area, they established a mission in 1797. Now this is part of the whole mission chain that goes from southern Baja California all the way up to Monterey, the California missions. Now it's important to remember that California began in Baja California. Really, California was what's now Baja California Sur. Loreto, that area is when it was first starting to be called California, and that was extended way up here. So for many people living in Baja California, they don't really like it when people just say Baja, you know. They prefer for people to remember that it's really Baja California because it is part of that same tradition. And the missionaries were working on trying to settle native people into small settlements where they could control them, where they could teach them to do agriculture and try to change their religion, their way of life. But as I mentioned earlier, there were, for many reasons, it failed. One of the main reasons being so many native people died that the missionaries didn't really have neophytes to populate the mission areas. This is especially bad in Baja California. In California, from San Diego north, you do find that the mission, there was more water for agriculture, so it was a little more successful up here. But unfortunately, during that time, huge numbers of people died, and some certain customs from that period, from the mission period, are still with us and are now considered part of traditional native life. So the idea of a graveyard is something that came from the mission period. Does anybody know what Indians in our area did before mission period for disposing of the dead? Right, they would have cremated people. And in fact, there are still a few places like down by Yuma where Quetzan and Cocopah, some Mojave groups still do that. They do a funeral pyre. It's very dramatic, and they have songs, special songs for that time. But after the mission period, most of the native people that lived around the missions started using a graveyard. And in Baja California, you find these piles of rocks over the graves. Some other things that came out of that time that are now considered traditional but really are only a couple of hundred years old are cattle ranching and agriculture. So we still find some agriculture, mostly very small scale, but cattle ranching turned out to be a way that people were able to extract some value from their environment, a new way, because the cattle go out, they eat everything up, they turn it into meat, and then you sell the meat. But unfortunately, there's a very big impact on the environment when you do that. So many species were wiped out from being eaten or from being stepped on, and most of the grasses that we have out there are exotic, so they're maybe European or from other places. So that was spread very much by cattle. They would be given these things as feed. The cattle go out and they do their thing out in the hills and leave the seeds out there with manure too. So of course they're going to grow well. But that devastated a lot of local populations of grasses and other types of plants. So today we do find people planting small plots of corn, beans, squash, which of course are all Native American plants. And today many children grow up feeling that this is part of their traditional culture, which it has become part of it. but it's actually fairly recent. Now, this is just one example of one of the communities. It kind of looks like it could be somewhere up in North County or East County, out in the hills. It's really the same environment. This is San Jose de la Zorra, where the basket makers live. And does anybody have an idea of what kind of trees those might be? Some of them could be willow, that's true. But most of these are one of the oaks. What do we get from the oak tree? Acorns, okay? One of the staple foods of native groups. People would have gathered the acorns, leached them, and you would have used a basket like this to kind of separate the different sized grains, and then made a gruel out of that, and that was one of the main foods. But some of the elders have pointed out to me it's not that that was our only or our most important food, it was a staple. It would have been like having potatoes with your meat. And in fact, the very best thing is when you have venison or some kind of meat to have with your shawi, which is what they call the acorn mush. So not surprisingly today, there are many settlements that are around acorn or the oak groves. What kind of a tree is this? Willow, good. Okay, this is Gloria Castañeda from San Jose de la Zorra, and she's cutting willow branches, especially for making this type of a basket. As you can see, this has, like all basketry, which is related to textiles, it has a warp and a weft. And so I think the weft goes right to left, right? The weft would be that way. So I guess this is the warp. This is the willow stem that's actually used, it's wrapped around other willow branches with lots of leaves, like some of those. And so they need to try to encourage the plants to grow nice, long, flexible, strong wands or stems. So they cut the trees in a certain way. They don't just go in and cut it all down. They cut certain parts. They call it a pruning. And this is similar with a lot of different Native American and especially Native Californian basket makers. They feel that they are managing this plant population, that they're encouraging it to grow in a certain way. And so depending on how they cut it, they can get the type of stems that they need. And that's what Gloria is doing there. Here you can see again the use of that stem for making a basket. This is the Juncus basketry that you saw. Here we go. This is a beautiful example from Celia Silva. This is Virginia, her daughter. And Celia has used here 3 different colors. This is the natural color from the Juncus, the lighter one. And then this is the part that comes from the about 5 or 6 inches at the base of certain type of Juncus. Juncus is a rush that grows in wetlands. And at the base of a certain type, it gets this nice reddish color, they call it. And then the black is actually made from kind of a witch's brew. They put in all these different things, oak bark and mud and sometimes nails, soot. There's all these different things that go into it. It looks like shoe polish or something. And they soak it in that for about a month, and that gives it this wonderful black color that I've noticed from museum exhibits that black will last for decades, whereas the red part can fade a little more. So the important thing here is that this was a tradition that links them with other California Indian groups. And these would have been used in many different ways for, say, cleaning to, they could separate. It's amazing to watch some of these ladies take something that they've ground and bounce it up and down, and next thing you know, they have the larger particles on one side and the fine stuff on the other side. It's another old picture from E.H. Davis. We can see an agave fiber net. So we're going to learn a little about the net. Remember, we saw a net at the beginning too, the woman who was carrying everything in a net. When you're mobile people, you really need to know, you need to have a way to move the few important things that you need to take with you. So here Teresa Castro is going to show us how she takes agave leaves, the same agave that they also eat, but here she's picked certain leaves and she's made a pit, Before she put them in there, she had a lot of coals in the pit. She's going to make a little oven. She's going to cover it up with sand, and they're going to cook. And the next day, she pulls them out, and they're all nice and cooked. And this whole process is just to get the fiber out of these agave leaves. You know, we just run down to the hardware store and we buy a ball of string. But in the old days, this is one of the most important things that people could have had. And so they went to a lot of work to extract the fiber. And archaeologists have found pieces of fiber that's made in exactly the same way with what we call a Z-twist, a certain way, this way that you'll see that she's making it. They found pieces of that in dry caves that go back 7,000 to 8,000 years. So it's a technology that worked, that people developed early on, and that they've kept using. Traditionally, she would have used an abalone to squeeze out the excess, and here she's using something like a distributor cap or some part from a car. So you see that people also adapt to the changes in their world. Now this is the fiber. She's washed it, and she's still removing some of the parts that she doesn't need. And she's taking a few pieces of the fiber. She'll twist them together. And this is something also common we find all around the world. People use their leg to do the twist. And probably I couldn't do it because I have hairy legs, and I tried it once and my fiber came out kind of black and white. But she'll twist many of these little sections together and then make one long section. And then she's using a thing called a taravilla. It's a special device to tighten it all up. And then that one big long piece of string, her daughters will help her wind it all up. And she'll eventually get this, which is what she's going to use to make agave fiber carrying net. They could make all kinds of different things. It could be used for cordage, could be used for nets, for fishing, for catching rabbits, or for a big carrying net, or this is a smaller one for gathering tunas, the prickly pears. So this is the little net that would have been made especially for gathering those prickly pears. And it's amazing to see. You take that, you fill it full of prickly pears, and you go like this, and those little tiny stickers, I'll wet this, they call them, yeah, they come off, and then you can handle it. Now, you remember we talked earlier about the pottery, and this is an example of a hearth. The pottery was used for cooking, for water storage, for food storage, and for ceremonial uses. Well, this is an example from about 1960 from Ralph Michelson and other anthropologists that work with the pai. He took a picture of people actually using a hearth like this. It's really just 3 stones, one in the back. And archaeologists often find hearths just like this in sites. In our area, people often just use the 3 stones. And you can see now why they wanted that nice round bottom that most of the older pots have, because it sort of distributes the heat better than a coffee table bottom would. So just to make this type of pottery again is another process that takes a long, long time. We don't even think about making clay. We just think, well, you go to Michael's, you get your clay, and then you fire it in a kiln. Well, in this case, native women of the Yunnan region have been making what we call paddle and anvil pottery for probably about 1,000 years. It got to our area maybe 700 or 800 years ago. And there's a whole process here that goes from gathering the clay in certain places where there are good deposits that the ladies, each lady has their own preferred place. And there's an art to just knowing which clods are good. Here Josefina is showing me, she's saying, oh, well, it's obvious. This one is good and this one's no good. Yeah, of course. Or it might have been the other way around. I honestly don't remember. But these were the 2 samples that were showing us which one was good and which isn't. And what they have to do is remove all those little pieces of rock. You can't just crush it in there. You have to remove it. Otherwise, your pot's going to break. So there's a long process of grinding it several times. Again, an older photo from 1960, and you can see the 2 different stages of grinding. And then from there, they knead it they liken a lot of this to making tortillas or bread, because now they're going to amasar, they're going to make the masa, the dough, and they knead it, and then in the end they put it in the oven. So there are many metaphors related to cooking bread. Here she's taking a coil and adding that to a tortilla-shaped piece of clay that she's put over this other pot, and this is how they begin one of these pots. So they weld those coils on, and they keep adding them, and they could make a double mouth pot, they could make a pot like this, or a larger one for storing food. Many different shapes that were traditionally made. This is Margarita, one of the main potters from Santa Catarina. This is her changarro, her little store, her gallery. She's a potter, and she's one of the ladies that's keeping this tradition alive. Of the whole Yuman region, there are only this handful of ladies that are still doing this. These ladies and one or two ladies in Mojave, and then there's actually there's a Kiliwa man, or a Cahuilla man, who's also been reviving the Cahuilla version of this. This is one of Margarita's daughters here at Balboa Park at Indian Days. So we've been bringing some of the potters and artisans up so that they can try to sell their stuff up here and make a little more up here than they would in Mexico. Now there's several other natural resources that people can use to try to make a living. This is yucca shedidera, Mojave yucca. And what, anybody know what you can use yucca for? Soap. And what else? A needle. Good, yeah, you can take the leaf and take the point with fiber, and you've got a needle and thread. But it's being used a lot down in Baja California. It's being bought by companies that turn it into soap and use it for, it has different industrial applications. It's very valuable. And the good thing about it is, you might say, oh my gosh, now they're going to wipe out all the yucca. But the good thing is if it's harvested in a carefully managed way, if it's done where they don't cut it all down, it's actually much better than when they clear the land and try to do agriculture and that fails. In this case, they can go back every 10 years or so and harvest more. So we feel that there are a lot of ways that if they can use their natural resources in a sustainable way, that can provide them with all the income they need without having to put, maquiladora factories or leave and go to the cities. Another thing that, another valuable resource they have are the seeds that come from different wildflowers. Often if you go and buy a wildflower mix at your local nursery, many of those seeds have come from Baja California. Another thing is ecotourism. This is San Diego Archaeological Society. Anybody know Steve Buscarin? Archaeologist from City College. He and people from the Archaeological Society have organized workshops and done that through our organization, CUNA. We take students down, they spend a weekend down there and they learn to make pottery, or they learn to make baskets, they learn to do an agave roast. And so in this case, people actually got to go through the whole process from harvesting to eating the finished agave. And since they're archaeologists, most of them, some just go along for the ride, but the archaeologists are fascinated because they're studying these things 500 years later or 1,000 years later, and they want to see how it got to, how it's produced. Here again, a basketry workshop at San Jose de la Zorra. And the nice thing for the tribes is that the ladies that do these workshops make about 10 times what they could make doing any other work in their area. And their knowledge is valued, and that's very important to them. They have a good time and they feel that they're valued as artists, as traditional people. So we're very happy about trying to promote more of this type of exchange. Here, Andres Vega from the same community is teaching people about native plant use. So this is some of the wild sage. There are people that want to go down and do a cattle drive. And so we're working in one of the communities in San Antonio, Nequa, to create an ecotourism visitor center. And the community really is very interested in having people join them to do this type of a cattle drive. Also, just the knowledge of the land and the stories. is something very valuable. Don Benito, who has since passed away, in this case was telling his grandkids about this rock back here. There are 3 rocks. There's another one over here and another one that are believed to be witches that were turned into stone. And so that knowledge of the landscape is something that's just so valuable culturally that we're very concerned about not losing that knowledge. And when we lose somebody like Don Benito, you know, you just lose a whole library, as they say. Today there are schools in most of the tribal communities, but most kids are growing up just speaking more Spanish and not so much the native language. A few final slides about some of the exchanges that we've done with groups up in Arizona. This is the Yavapai, when they invited us up to talk about native plants and their medicinal uses and other uses. This woman is Yavapai, and this is Teodora we saw earlier. She's Yavapai, she's Kumeyaay, and Josefina is Pai and Kiliwa, and then Don Benito, who's passed away, he's Pai. And so they all went and found that their languages were fairly intelligible between themselves. They could pretty much sit there and have a conversation. So it's probably like Spanish and Portuguese or Spanish and Italian, that there's a lot that's very similar. And they also, on this trip, the Yavapai took us to some rock art sites. If you can, I don't know how well you can see that, but there's rock art all over this beautiful rock. And they just wanted to get the input of our folks about any kind of interpretations they might have. And of course, what I mentioned earlier about looking at the plants, talking about their names and uses, and comparing that with what the Yavapai had. And it was really quite impressive that so many of the names for plants and natural things were the same. So for example, bighorn sheep in most of the groups down here in Kumeyaay and Pai is something like mu or emu. And it's the same thing all the way up into the Grand Canyon with the Havasupai and the Yavapai, they say mu. So it sort of it reminds you how much history there is that's shared and very ancient history and culture. It's just so important to try to learn as much as we can. And part of the effort that we're doing is to help some of these communities make community museums so they can teach their own people about their own history and their culture, and also teach the rest of us that want to learn. This was from an exhibit at Museum of Man on Native People of Baja California. But now there's more of an effort to try to do these kinds of things in the communities, the native communities themselves. Well, thank you for being very attentive, and